Runaway brides of Reddit. What's your story? What was the final straw? Welcome back to our channel. If you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Story 1. I've been holding on to this story for a long time, but now feels like the right time to share it. Several years ago, I was a single mom, working hard but feeling like I wasn't making any progress. Then I met a man who seemed like a great match. He was an architect, funny and charming. We dated for about a year before getting engaged. But then something unimaginable happened, and this is where I know some people might see me as the bad person in this story. He was in a severe car accident, resulting in serious injuries. He broke both of his femurs and his back, about 10 months before our wedding. He was also diabetic, which made his recovery much harder and slower. He ended up needing a wheelchair, and his legs had to stay extended straight out in front of him at all times due to his injuries. I truly tried to stick by him, but it became increasingly difficult. He was extremely resistant to his treatment. He refused physical therapy, didn't take his medication properly, and didn't cooperate with his medical care. His attitude became worse over time. He developed an addiction to the pain medication, sleeping pills, and anxiety medication. Through all of this, wedding planning was still ongoing, mostly managed by his family. He was eventually moved from a hospital to a care facility, but his condition only worsened. At the care facility, his moods were unpredictable, and he became verbally abusive. One evening, after missing a question on a game show, he threw a urinal at me. Despite doctors insisting that he needed to start moving his legs, he flat out refused to try. The day of our wedding arrived. The staff at the care facility went all out to decorate the yard and make the day special. Everything looked lovely. Our families were seated, and the pianist was playing. When the time came for us to walk down the aisle, I was shocked when I saw him, still in his wheelchair with his legs extended and covered by a blanket. I froze. I told my dad I needed a moment, and once we were out of sight, I told him I couldn't go through with it. My dad, with a calm smile, simply said, "Thank God." He signaled for my kids to join us, and we left the wedding right then. We drove off, moving to another state to be closer to my family, and things started to improve for us. The man I was supposed to marry continued to struggle with his health, going in and out of facilities, and he never regained the ability to walk. I understand he was going through immense physical, emotional, and mental pain that I can't fully comprehend. But I knew that I couldn't raise my children in that environment, and my primary responsibility was to them. Since then, I completed my degree, and my children are now adults. We've all moved forward, and I haven't had to deal with any of that negativity since. Story 2. When I was 16, I worked at a store in the mall called Chess King. One day, a man came in who seemed really interested in me. He initially told me he was 20, but I later found out he was actually 26. I had some personal issues at the time and was drawn to the attention. Before long, I thought I was in love with him. Just 2 weeks later, he proposed to me. He even asked my parents for permission, and unfortunately, they said yes, something I still feel upset about. Summer was coming up, and he asked me to move in with him for the season. I lived in New York, and he was staying in Maryland temporarily for a job as a used car salesman. He had been visiting his parents in New York, and we decided I'd join him there. I got into his white pickup truck, and we drove to Maryland. When we arrived, I found the apartment to be much smaller than I expected, and the neighborhood was unfamiliar and made me feel out of place. It was a predominantly black neighborhood, and I was white. He had leased the apartment without knowing much about it, and we didn't have internet back then to do any research. While he went to work every day, I had no transportation, so I spent my time walking around the area. I didn't feel comfortable, and people would often stare at me. He wanted to be intimate with me every day when he returned home from work. I wasn't comfortable with it, but I felt trapped and would just try to get through it. Then, after 5 days, I was at the apartment alone and saw a cockroach crawl across the silverware. I don't know why, but in that moment, I just snapped and thought, I can't do this anymore. I packed my suitcase and waited on the couch for him to return. When he came home, I just told him, "Take me home." He was angry and said a lot of things, but I just repeated that I wanted to go back to New York. Somehow, he agreed to take me back, and we left that night. On the drive back, he kept talking about how we would still be together, but I stayed silent. When we arrived, I took off the ring he had given me and placed it on the console of his truck. Without saying a word, I went into the house and locked the door behind me. He didn't try to follow me, but he called repeatedly for weeks, and I refused to answer. I never saw him again. Now, at 41, I have 4 children, and my oldest is 18. Only as an adult have I truly understood how wrong and scary that whole experience was. For years, I was too embarrassed to share this story, but now I realize that I was a child, and it's not my fault. It's the man's actions and my parents' decision that should be questioned. Story 3. I had a friend who found out she was the bride halfway down the aisle. Her parents, following traditional customs from their culture, had arranged a marriage for her. She was told the family was going to attend a cousin's wedding, and that everyone would be wearing white, though she didn't know why. They arrived at the church just before the bride was scheduled to walk down the aisle. My friend, thinking they were running late, wanted to sneak in and sit at the back. However, her father took her arm and started walking her up the aisle. It wasn't until they were halfway down that she stopped and realized everyone was looking at her, smiling and crying tears of joy. Confused, she turned to one of her aunts sitting in the pew next to her and asked, "Who's getting married?" The whole church went silent, and then the aunt turned to my friend's father and said, "You can't be serious. You planned a wedding for your daughter without even telling her? Did they even meet before this? Did you really think this would work?" The room started murmuring, and her father simply cleared his throat and told her to keep walking. Fortunately, the aunt grabbed my friend, pulled her into the pew, and quickly ushered her out of the church. Her parents disowned her after that, and she moved in with her aunt. For context, they were an Indian family living in the US. Her parents were very traditional, and my friend had expressed that she didn't want to marry just yet and preferred to focus on her career. Story 4. A woman I briefly dated had been in an emotionally abusive relationship with her ex. While he never physically hurt her, he constantly belittled her, making her feel worthless. He told her she was lucky to be with him, that she could never find anyone better, and that she was unattractive, but that he tolerated it. Despite being an intelligent and capable person, she was a medic in the military and had saved many lives during her time in Pakistan. He manipulated her into believing she wasn't worthy of better. On the day of her wedding, her father, who had been absent for much of her life after a divorce when she was a teenager, noticed that she was repeating many of the hurtful things her fiancé had said. During a private moment with her before the ceremony, he grew concerned and, out of the blue, suggested they go to Dairy Queen, a place they used to go when she was younger. They left together, and instead of heading to the church, he drove her to a Dairy Queen in a town far away, where they sat and talked for hours. While they were there, her phone rang nonstop, but she didn't answer. She later shared that during that time, she felt a huge weight lift off her shoulders. She knew her friends and family would be upset, but they would understand in the end. Her father then went back to the church, informed the bridal party that the wedding was off, and with the help of some friends, moved all her things out the next day. While her father may not have been perfect in her teenage years, she said that on that day, he was everything she needed. We dated for a few weeks, but eventually realized we weren't the right match for each other. We parted ways on good terms, and I haven't been in touch with her since. Story 5. My boyfriend at the time had a female friend who, the night before her wedding, finally confided in several of us, including him, that her fiancé had been emotionally and physically abusive toward her. She wasn't sure if she should go through with the marriage. We had all noticed her becoming more distant, but every time we asked if something was wrong, she denied it. The next day, her family quickly stepped in to alert all the guests, and a group of her friends went to her fiancé's house to help her retrieve all her belongings. My boyfriend was a police officer, so he had a responsibility to take action regarding the situation, though I wasn't entirely clear on the legal details at the time. At first, the woman was upset with him, but a few years later, she started dating someone wonderful, someone I've known for a long time, and she is much happier now. She's also gained confidence, knowing that her friends and family are there for her and will always have her back when it matters. Story 6. This story isn't mine, but my mom's. A few weeks before her wedding, my mom called it off after discovering that her fiancé had lied to her about his whereabouts. She found out he was partying at a hotel with friends and other women. The final straw was when she caught him in a hot tub at 1 a.m. with twin sisters. Fast forward about 3 years and she starts dating again and eventually marries the man who became my biological father. The awkward part came when she met his family. Turns out, my father had 3 sisters, 2 of whom were the same twin sisters my mom had caught her ex-fiancé within that hot tub. To clarify a few things, my mom and dad eventually got married after she got over the initial shock of meeting his sisters. They stayed together for a long time before eventually divorcing. It had nothing to do with his sisters or his family. It was just a matter of incompatibility and frequent disagreements. Sadly, my dad wasn't the most faithful man either, which is one thing I definitely didn't inherit from him. Thankfully, I take after my mom when it comes to being loyal in relationships. Story 7. This isn't my story, but it's my best friend's. Note: I have her permission to share this. Back in high school, I had a friend named Cheyenne. We were very close and loved talking about our dream weddings. Every month when the new bridal magazines came out, we'd spend our free period sitting on a bench, circling and gushing over the dresses. Fast forward to junior year, and Cheyenne met a guy named Nick. He was pretty popular at school, mainly because of his older sisters who were triplets. Cheyenne and Nick started dating, but things weren't great. Their relationship was very on and off, and it was known that he wasn't faithful when she wasn't around. After high school, they broke up for a bit, but about 3 to 4 months later, they got back together. Midway through their second year of college, Cheyenne started acting very differently. She began drinking heavily, which led to a falling out between us for about a year. Eventually, we reconnected after she found out she was pregnant with Nick's baby. They were planning to get married, and I was so happy for her. We had rekindled our closeness, and I was going to be her maid of honor. They had planned a beautiful wedding in the mountains. The day of the wedding, though, Cheyenne seemed off. She insisted everything was fine, but I kept an eye on her. About 15 minutes before we were supposed to walk down the aisle, I stepped outside to see where she was because she had disappeared for a while. I found a pair of her shoes by the road, and, assuming she might come back, I told the wedding coordinator about it. The ceremony was delayed, and we started looking for Cheyenne. I saw Nick get really angry and heard him muttering, "That damn girl. When I get my hands on her." At that point, I was really concerned for her, especially with the way he was reacting. I started to think she might have run off, considering their past and what I just heard. I drove into town, only a 10-minute drive, but quite a walk, and found Cheyenne, in her white dress, walking into a bar. I went in to talk to her, asking what happened, and she broke down. She told me that Nick had been abusive toward her since high school, verbally, physically, and even sexually. That morning, he had threatened her and the baby, telling her if she didn't behave, he would hurt them both. I called the police right away and informed the wedding coordinator to cancel everything. I drove Cheyenne to the hospital, where she got the care she needed. After a long, difficult trial and a restraining order, Nick was arrested. Cheyenne moved to Portland to be close to her family and away from him. Now, she's getting remarried in September 2020, and her daughter, Harmony, is 4 years old and doing beautifully. Story 8. On my 18th birthday, my boyfriend proposed to me in front of all my family and friends at my party. I said yes, mostly out of embarrassment because I wasn't ready for that kind of commitment. We'd been dating for 2 years, but I was just about to start university and wasn't ready for marriage at all. Later, when we were alone, I asked if we could have a long engagement, at least a year or two, and he agreed. We told our families we'd be waiting to get married. However, just a few months later, both our mothers took me out for lunch and decided we should start looking at wedding dresses because it's never too early to plan. When I found a beautiful dress on sale, my fiance's mother insisted on buying it for me, saying they were happy to cover the major costs since they were the ones who wanted a big wedding. She joked that I could pay her back with grandchildren. Not long after, she introduced me to a friend who was a florist, and soon I was looking at bouquets and table arrangements. Then my fiancé started talking about venues and said we needed to start planning to find the perfect place. At this point, I was feeling overwhelmed. I was just starting university, still figuring out what I wanted to do with my education, and now I was supposed to choose a wedding venue for a wedding that was still years away. A wedding that was quickly turning into something extravagant. I tried talking to my fiancé, but he didn't listen. We found a venue we liked, but they weren't available for nearly 2 years. So, we booked it, and I thought I had time to prepare for the big day. Then, out of the blue, the venue had a cancellation for a date just 6 months away, and my fiancé accepted it without consulting me. He just changed our date and began planning the entire wedding with the help of his mom and mine, who was just as overbearing. When he told me everything was booked, I was furious. His response was that he had made all the decisions regarding catering, flowers, and the venue based on what I had wanted, so I should be grateful he had taken care of the stressful parts. All I needed to do was show up. When I explained that I wasn't ready for a wedding in 6 months, and that I had repeatedly told him I wasn't ready for marriage yet, he told me I was being childish and that the invitations were already at the printer, so there was no turning back. That's when I realized I was being manipulated. I returned the engagement ring and told him I didn't want to see him anymore. I told my family and friends, cried a lot, and changed my number because he wouldn't stop calling. 2 months later, my mom got a call from his mother, who couldn't understand why I hadn't been responding about dress fittings and finalizing bridesmaids. She didn't know we had broken up. My mother explained everything, and I thought that was the end of it. But the following week, his mother had the audacity to send my family a bill for half of what they had spent on the wedding, thousands of pounds. They had booked everything, from the cake to the favors, without telling me, and now they wanted me to pay. Story 9. This isn't my story, but someone I know had to spend money on flights to an exotic location twice because the bride ran out on the groom. The first time, she left just before the rehearsal was supposed to start. The second time was right at the altar. You think the groom would have taken the hint after the first incident, but this was a situation where a wealthy, though not conventionally handsome, man had managed to date a supermodel. In his fear of losing her, he tried to pressure her into committing, using emotional manipulation rather than coercion. Feeling guilty, she was convinced to go through with it both times. From the pictures my friend showed me, it was clear that the groom was reaching way beyond what seemed realistic. While I can understand why he didn't want to let go, I can't support the idea of manipulating someone into pretending to love you or deluding yourself into thinking it could work, especially after the first failed attempt. By that point, you're only setting yourself up for disappointment. Story 10. This isn't my story, but it's my best friend's. I guess you could call it a runaway bride situation because she called off her wedding just 2 days before it was supposed to happen. She was engaged to her girlfriend at the time. My friend is with men now, and one day, while her fiance was out, my friend used her laptop to check something. She had a gut feeling that something was off, so when she logged into her girlfriend's social media, she discovered that her fiance was having an ongoing conversation with someone else, a woman who worked at the vet where they took their dog for treatment. The conversation was happening in real time, and it became clear that her fiancé was being unfaithful. After the wedding was called off, her ex-fiancé ended up marrying the woman from the vet, but the marriage didn't last long. They had a huge fight, and during the altercation, the vet worker bit a chunk of skin off her ex's head. As if that wasn't strange enough, witnesses say that the sliding glass door the vet worker was standing in front of suddenly fell and knocked her out, even though she never touched it. My friend is now in a healthy, happy relationship with a man, and she can't help but laugh at how karma handled that whole situation. Story 11. This isn't my story, but it's about a friend's wedding. He was about to marry a woman who, to put it simply, was stunning. She had everything: beauty, confidence, and she rocked the dress like no one else. We were all happy for him because he wasn't the most conventionally attractive guy, but he had so many talents. He could garden, design, craft, and even build things. He designed a watering system for his garden, and when he finished it, he was really proud. We joked and said, "Couldn't you just use a sprinkler?" He laughed and said, "Yeah, but I made this." The wedding day started like any other. Everyone was excited, chatting, and meeting her family, who gave off some weird vibes. Not in a cult-like way, but more like they were just going through the motions and wanted to get it over with. The ceremony began, with the flower girls walking down the aisle, the bride entering, and everything going smoothly. Then, right before the vows, our friend just bolted. He ran out the door and left the bride standing there, shocked. But what happened next was even more bizarre. The bride, her father, and her mother pulled out guns and chased after him. I'm not exaggerating. They ran out after him, but he was already too far away and safe. As for what happened to them afterward, the bride's father ended up in jail, her mother passed away from a heart attack a year later, and the bride, now somewhat of a minor influencer, found someone else to get involved with. The reason he left was that she had been emotionally abusive. She made him track where he was, who he was talking to, how much money he had, when he'd be back, and what he was doing. She even refused to let him sleep in their bed, and if he fell asleep on the couch, she'd wake him up by slapping him. In their 3 years together, they only had sex twice, and he described it as terrible, like she was completely uninterested. She had no responsibility in her life. Her parents bought her a house, a car, and other things, but she crashed the car when she grew tired of it. She was incredibly manipulative and toxic, and my friend was lucky to get out of that situation. Story 12. I'm the groom, and I left the relationship after what felt like a year of emotional and mental turmoil. My ex-partner was struggling with mental health issues when we started dating. She had been on medication but didn't tell me about it. After we moved in together, she stopped taking her medication without any warning, and things quickly became very difficult. Her behavior was abusive, both emotionally and physically. She would go out without telling me, refuse to answer her phone, and then yell at me for things like watching movies with actresses she disliked. She became jealous and controlling, demanding that I stay home all the time, even showing up at my work randomly to check if I was being unfaithful. She was unemployed, while I had a stable job, which I was fortunate to keep, thanks to the understanding of my boss. Why did I stay? I wasn't in a good mental place myself. Growing up in an abusive environment had made me think that this kind of treatment was normal, and I didn't know how to get out of it. Eventually, I agreed to marry her, and we planned the wedding. The ceremony happened, and everyone thought we were married. But I had a moment of clarity and realized I couldn't move forward until she got help. I refused to sign the marriage certificate until she went to counseling and started taking her medication again. She refused, and I put the certificate away. At that point, I thought that was the end of it. In secret, I started going to counseling on my own. I began to get healthier, and I moved my finances into a separate account. She continued her behavior, and eventually, I disappeared, leaving her behind. Fast forward 4 years. I had a new partner who was incredibly supportive, and I was planning to propose to her. Just as I was preparing to take that step, I received an email from my ex. She told me that we were actually married, and she wanted a divorce because she had met someone new and was planning to marry him. I was shocked. It turned out that she had taken matters into her own hands. After I had refused to sign the certificate, she went to the courthouse with someone who looked like me and filed the paperwork. Legally, we were married, and I had no idea. I was upset, but also relieved that I found out before I proposed to my current girlfriend. My girlfriend was understanding and stayed by me while I dealt with the legal mess. After consulting with a couple of lawyers, I learned that since there was no concrete proof of the deception, there was little I could do. Fortunately, my ex just wanted the divorce and didn't seek anything further. Her new fiance broke up with her, and she dragged her feet with the divorce process, but in the end, everything was sorted out. She still tries to contact me occasionally, but I just ignore her. These days, I'm happily married to my amazing wife, the woman who stood by me through everything. We have 2 children together, and life is good. Story 13. I wasn't a runaway bride, but I was hired to work a wedding as a florist many years ago. The bride and groom had signed all the contracts and were ready for the big day. The bride was on tour until just 2 weeks before the wedding. She works in theater, so most of our communication was through email, and the groom would come by to make payments and drop off items for the wedding. He was always very laid back, which isn't always the case with grooms. However, it turned out that he was secretly seeing the bride's sister and also the best man's girlfriend, who was part of their friend group. The bride found out right before the bachelorette party, and she decided to call off the entire wedding. I felt bad about not being able to refund the payments, since we had already ordered the flowers, but I offered her credit towards another event. We stayed in touch and became Facebook friends. Now, she's happily married to someone else and seems so much more content. Story 14. This isn't my story, but it's about my cousin. He was supposed to marry a woman who met someone new just 2 days before the wedding. She fell for him so quickly that she ended up calling off the wedding, not literally at the altar, but it was incredibly close. I was about 5 or 6 years old and was supposed to be the flower girl, and my 16-year-old brothers were ushers. We lived about 6 hours away, and I remember being so confused during the ride home, wondering why I didn't get to be the flower girl while everyone else was quiet and distant. In a small world twist, the man she fell in love with ended up being a professor at the same university as my brother, and they have an office just down the hall from each other. He and the bride have been happily married for almost 20 years now. As for my cousin, he's been married 3 times, has multiple DUI charges, and has struggled with his health. I think the bride definitely made the right decision. Story 15. At 20, I met a guy who claimed to be in the army. This was before widespread internet access, so there was no easy way to verify his story. We hit it off, and I was young, falling quickly for guys, so when he proposed, I was over the moon. Looking back, there were several warning signs. He asked my parents for permission, proposed loudly at a pizza shop, which made it nearly impossible to say no, didn't have his own place, and I never met his family. Plus, I never saw any proof that he was in the military. A few weeks later, we had a fight after he accidentally called me by his sister's name during an intimate moment. He tried to brush it off, saying everything would be fine because we were going to Kentucky, where he said we'd live on an army base. He also jokingly said he wanted me to be barefoot and pregnant most of the time. We were planning to get married the day after I graduated. I started to do some serious thinking, becoming more withdrawn and distant. One day, while visiting my grandmother, she asked me, "Are you in love with him, or with the idea of getting married?" That simple question made everything click. I realized I wasn't truly in love with him, and I wasn't ready for marriage. I cried and broke up with him just 2 weeks before graduation. Apparently, he had already booked the justice of the peace. He ended up getting married 3 weeks later, with the same ring he had given me. I can only hope his new wife has a better experience than I did. Story 16. This is a story about a friend of mine. He had been in a relationship with a girl he met in university for about 3 or 4 years. They seemed to have a solid connection with a lot in common, similar values around religion, family, and their future education goals. Everything seemed set for their upcoming wedding until 1 week before the big day, when she went out on a date with another guy. How did my friend find out? She came home that night, told him she had been out on a date with someone from work, and then tried to climb into bed. She was a bit drunk and acted like nothing had happened. But when my friend confronted her, asking what she was doing, she simply said she was tired and wanted to go to sleep. That's when he made the decision to end things. He kicked her out of the bed and told her they were done. The aftermath was a mess. The wedding plans were called off, and there were a lot of awkward conversations with family and friends. The whole situation left my friend emotionally shaken, and he struggled with the impact for about a year. It was a tough experience for him, but over time, he managed to heal. Story 17. This is a story about my boyfriend's friend. The night before her wedding, this woman confided in several friends, including my boyfriend, that her fiance had been emotionally and physically abusive toward her, and she wasn't sure if she should go through with the wedding. We had all noticed her pulling away, but she had always denied that anything was wrong. The next day, her family acted quickly to inform the guests, and a group of her friends essentially broke into the fiance's house to retrieve all of her belongings. At the time, my boyfriend was a police officer, so he felt a responsibility to take action, but I wasn't entirely clear on the legal side of things. The woman was upset with him for a while after the situation, but fast forward a few years, and she's now with someone great, a guy I've known for a long time, and she seems much happier. She's also learned how strong her support system is, knowing that her friends and family will always have her back and help her get things done when needed. Story 18. This isn't my story, but it's about my sister, who called off her engagement just 4 months before her wedding, which had already been planned and paid for. I don't know all the details, and she hasn't opened up fully about it, even now, 18 months later. But I never really liked her fiancé. He was generally nice, but had a serious problem with alcohol. He couldn't just have one drink. He'd drink excessively, then come home, and often be sick all over the house. He also became very controlling about her going out with friends, eventually forbidding her from doing so. His family situation wasn't much better. His parents had moved away, and his extended family didn't approve of my sister. His younger brother had his own drama with a teenage girlfriend, which added more stress to the situation. From what my sister has told us, she felt trapped. She wasn't allowed to hang out with her friends, and was forced to attend family events where she wasn't welcome. He also isolated her from us, and I think that really hurt her. She missed out on spending time with family, especially her nephews. Finally, on New Year's Eve, she ended the relationship and canceled the wedding. I don't think she even saw him after that. When he came to collect his things, she wasn't home. His family was upset and tried to pressure her for months, but she became depressed and needed medication. The wedding bill still had to be covered by our family, but they were just relieved to have my sister back and to see her happy again. Story 19. My girlfriend's friend recently married someone who is not a nice person. On their first date, he made a hurtful comment about her appearance, and over time, he pressured her to sell her home to buy a much larger house that he wanted. He also isolated her from her friends, and there are concerns that he might be abusive, though we don't know all the details. At the wedding, he put together a slideshow, and most of the pictures were of him with his friends, with only a few featuring him and his wife. During his speech, he spent most of the time talking about how grateful he was for his friends. We were all hoping she might back out before it was too late, but unfortunately, she went through with it. At the reception, she understandably got drunk, and he criticized her for it, calling her an embarrassment, even though he was quite drunk himself. If you or someone you know is in a difficult or unhealthy situation, please reach out for help or let your friends support you. It's important to be there for each other. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.